The world thought it had already witnessed the final chapter of Queen Elizabeth II's legacy, but what followed her passing became a quiet storm beneath the surface of royal tradition. Behind the ceremonial silence, behind the black attire and carefully arranged public mourning, something unexpected began to shift inside the monarchy. Titles were reassigned, responsibilities were redistributed, and estates, some unseen by the public, some locked away in centuries of royal history, began to change hands in ways few could have predicted. At first, it looked like routine succession. Prince William stepping into the Duchy of Cornwall, King Charles consolidating authority as the new monarch, a familiar pattern repeating itself across generations of the crown. But then came the development that disrupted that sense of order entirely. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, long positioned outside the formal structure of royal life, was suddenly linked to one of Queen Elizabeth II's most private and historically significant estates. And that single detail changed everything. Because this wasn't just land. It wasn't just property. It was a symbol of royal continuity, trust, and inner circle privilege. Something that had always remained tightly controlled within the most traditional boundaries of the monarchy. And now, it was connected to the very couple who had stepped away from royal duties, challenged the institution publicly, and built an independent life thousands of miles away in California. The question spread instantly across royal circles, media platforms, and global audiences. How did this happen? And more importantly, why them? In the days following Queen Elizabeth's passing at Balmoral Castle on September 8, 2022, the monarchy entered a state of transition unlike anything seen in modern history. The Queen had been more than a head of state. She had been the anchor of a carefully balanced system, one that managed not only political symbolism but also private family structure, financial distribution, and inherited influence. When she was gone, that balance shifted, not dramatically in public view, but quietly, internally, in ways that only became visible through inheritance patterns, legal adjustments, and estate transitions that unfolded behind palace walls. What the public saw was ceremony. What the palace experienced was restructuring. And within that restructuring, estates tied closely to the Queen's personal legacy became central to a far more complicated conversation about power, responsibility, and belonging within the royal family. Because estates in the monarchy are never just assets. They are instruments of influence. They determine who manages land, who oversees staff, who maintains historic properties, and who quietly holds authority in spaces that never appear in official speeches or public engagements. And now, one of those estates was reportedly connected to Harry and Meghan. For some inside the royal institution, the development was seen as surprising but symbolic, a gesture that reflected the Queen's long-standing emotional bond with her grandson. For others, it raised uncomfortable questions about structure, fairness, and long-term planning within the monarchy. Because once an estate of this significance moves, it does not simply change ownership. It changes influence. And influence in the royal family is never neutral. It shapes relationships, hierarchies, and perception. As details emerged, the estate itself became a focal point of speculation. While official clarity remained limited, the symbolic weight of the situation overshadowed the specifics. What mattered most was not the legal paperwork, but the meaning behind it. A couple once described as outside the institution, now appearing, in some form, connected to one of its most protected legacies. For Prince Harry, the moment carried a deeper emotional layer. His relationship with Queen Elizabeth II had always stood apart from the wider turbulence of royal life. While tensions existed between other family members, the Queen's connection with Harry was often described as steady, personal, and deeply affectionate. She had known him not just as a prince, but as a grandson navigating identity, duty, and independence under global scrutiny. That bond became part of how many interpreted this development, not as politics, but as legacy, a quiet extension of trust from a monarch who spent her life balancing tradition with family. Yet inside Buckingham Palace, interpretations varied. Because while sentiment plays a role in royal history, structure plays a greater one. And any shift involving estate control naturally raises questions about authority, oversight, and long-term implications for the monarchy's internal framework. At the same time, King Charles had already begun shaping his own vision for a streamlined and more focused royal institution, one built around fewer working members, clearer responsibilities, and tighter operational structure. In that context, any redistribution of estates, especially those tied to the Queen's personal holdings, carried added significance, not just as inheritance, but as alignment, or misalignment, between tradition and transition, between past monarchy and future monarchy. And as speculation grew, so did public fascination, because the idea of Harry and Meghan gaining influence over a royal estate, even indirectly, challenged a long-standing narrative about their place within the institution. Since stepping back from royal duties in 2020, their path had been defined by independence, criticism, and reinvention. Media ventures, public speaking, philanthropic work, and brand building in the United States had become their new identity. Yet this development suggested something more complex, a continued connection to the very institution they had stepped away from, not as working royals, but as inheritors of legacy. And that contradiction became the center of global discussion. Supporters viewed it as a natural reflection of family bonds surviving institutional change. Critics saw it as confusion within the royal structure. Analysts described it as a symbolic overlap between personal inheritance and constitutional tradition that the modern monarchy is still learning how to navigate. But beneath all interpretations, one fact remained consistent. The monarchy was evolving, quietly, unevenly, and in ways that often became visible only through moments like this. As attention widened, comparisons were drawn between different estates under royal oversight. Sandringham in Norfolk, Balmoral in Scotland, properties that had long represented not just wealth, but emotional grounding for the royal family. These were not ceremonial palaces. They were private sanctuaries, spaces where the monarchy became human, where formal titles faded into family roles, where history was not performed, but lived. And within that emotional geography, even small changes in control or association carry symbolic weight that extends far beyond legal ownership. Because in the royal world, land is never just land. It is memory, it is continuity, it is identity, which is why the idea of redistribution, especially involving members no longer formally working within the monarchy, created such intense conversation. Meanwhile, inside the broader family structure, tensions and transitions continued to overlap. Prince William focused on future-facing responsibilities tied to his role as heir. King Charles balanced modernization with tradition, and Harry and Meghan continued building a parallel life that still, in unexpected ways, intersected with the institution they left behind. A dual narrative emerged, separation and connection existing at the same time. Distance, but not disconnection. Independence, but not complete detachment. And this estate development, whatever its exact structure, became a symbol of that complexity. It showed that royal relationships do not simply end when roles change. They transform, sometimes visibly, sometimes quietly, sometimes in ways even those inside the institution are still learning to interpret. As public discussion intensified, one theme consistently resurfaced: Queen Elizabeth II's role as the emotional center of the family. Her influence was not limited to governance or tradition. It extended into personal relationships, often acting as a stabilizing force between conflicting perspectives. Her bond with Harry in particular was frequently described as one of understanding and affection, even during periods of public tension. And because of that, many observers interpreted the estate connection as part of a long-term legacy of keeping family ties intact, even when institutional roles diverged. Not a political decision, but a personal one, a final reflection of a monarch who always prioritized continuity of family, even within a system built on hierarchy. Still, the implications remain open-ended, because what appears as inheritance today can evolve into influence tomorrow, and what is symbolic now can become structural later. The monarchy has always been defined by this tension, between permanence and change, between tradition and adaptation, between public expectation and private reality. And this moment sits directly inside that tension, not as a conclusion, but as a question still unfolding. What does it mean when members of a modern royal family, some inside the institution, some outside it, continue to share fragments of its legacy? Is it reconciliation in progress? Is it structural overlap that has not yet been fully defined? Or is it the beginning of a new form of monarchy altogether, one where boundaries are less rigid and legacy is shared in more complex ways? For now, there are no final answers, only shifting interpretations. and a royal story that continues to evolve beneath the surface of tradition. Because in the end, the monarchy has never been just about who holds the crown. It has always been about who holds the story. And right now, that story is still being rewritten. Quietly, carefully, and in full view of the world. And as that story continues to unfold, the most striking part is not what has been officially confirmed, but what the development represents in the wider imagination of royal watchers, historians, and even critics of the monarchy itself. Because the idea of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle being connected to one of Queen Elizabeth II's private estates does not exist in isolation. It sits inside a much larger narrative that has been building for years. A narrative shaped by separation, reinvention, public scrutiny, and the slow, complicated reshaping of what the modern royal family actually is. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to understand what the monarchy represents beyond the headlines. It is not just a family. It is a system built on continuity. And continuity depends on one essential rule: stability of inheritance. Every estate, every title, every property, every responsibility is part of a carefully balanced structure designed to preserve the identity of the crown across generations. Nothing moves casually. Nothing is reassigned without consequence. Even symbolic gestures carry, which is why any suggestion of change involving historically significant royal estates immediately becomes more than a personal story. It becomes a constitutional conversation. Inside that framework, Harry and Meghan's connection to a queen-linked estate, whether symbolic, legal, partial, or narrative-driven, takes on significance that extends far beyond family dynamics. It raises questions that the monarchy has been quietly forced to confront since the Queen's passing. What happens when modern identity no longer fits traditional roles? What happens when family bonds extend beyond institutional boundaries? And what happens when legacy is no longer controlled by proximity to the crown, but by emotional connection to it? For Prince Harry, those questions have defined much of his adult life. He was born into a structure that gave him privilege, visibility, and duty, but limited his autonomy in ways that became increasingly difficult to reconcile with personal experience. His years of service in the military, his public role within the royal family, and later his decision to step back from official duties all reflect a long internal conflict between obligation and independence. For Meghan Markle, the transition was even more abrupt. Entering the monarchy from outside its traditions placed her under a level of global scrutiny that few people ever experience. Every gesture, every appearance, every decision became part of a wider narrative about belonging, adaptation, and resistance to institutional pressure. Together, they became a focal point of a global debate about tradition versus modernity. And now, the idea of them being connected to a royal estate reintroduces a new layer to that debate, because it suggests that separation from royal duties does not necessarily mean separation from royal legacy. That distinction matters deeply inside the institution. Within Buckingham Palace, legacy is not just symbolic, it is operational. Estates are tied to management structures, staffing systems, historical preservation duties, and long-term financial planning. Even when properties are private or semi-private, they remain part of a larger ecosystem that supports the monarchy's identity and stability. So any change in association, even perceived association, creates ripples, not because of sentiment alone, but because of structure. And structure is what the monarchy relies on most. At the same time, King Charles's reign has been marked by an ongoing effort to modernize that structure. A smaller working royal family, a more defined chain of responsibility, a clearer separation between public duty and private life. These goals have been widely reported as part of his long-term vision for the crown. But modernization in a centuries-old institution is never simple. Every adjustment exposes tension points that were previously held together by tradition rather than clarity. And the situation surrounding Harry and Meghan, particularly any connection to royal assets, sits directly within those tension points. Public reaction has reflected that complexity. Some view it as a symbolic bridge, proof that family ties still matter, even after formal roles change. Others see it as confusion in the system, where emotional relationships and institutional rules overlap in ways that are difficult to define. Royal commentators have pointed out that this is not the first time private sentiment and public duty have collided within the monarchy, but it may be one of the most visible in the modern media age. Because today, every shift is instant. Every rumor becomes global discussion. Every symbolic detail becomes interpreted as strategy, and every connection, real or perceived, becomes part of a larger narrative about the future of the crown. Within that narrative, Queen Elizabeth II remains a central figure whose presence still shapes interpretation even after her passing. Her reign represented stability in a rapidly changing world. She understood the importance of tradition, but she also understood the need for controlled evolution. Much of the modern monarchy's structure exists because of decisions she made to preserve continuity while adapting quietly to change. This is why her relationship with Harry continues to be referenced so often in discussions like this, because she represented balance. And Harry, in many ways, represents transition. The estate, again, whether viewed as literal inheritance or symbolic association, becomes a meeting point between those two ideas: balance and transition, tradition and change, institution and individuality. And that intersection is where the monarchy's future is being shaped. Meanwhile, Harry's identity continues to evolve outside the UK. His public statements often reflect a deep emotional connection to Britain, its culture, humor, military traditions, and sense of shared identity. Even as his life is now rooted in California, those ties remain visible in the way he speaks, the causes he supports, and the values he often references in public appearances. That emotional duality is central to understanding his position in this story. He is not fully inside the institution, but he is not fully outside its legacy either. He exists in a space between roles, and that space is where modern royal identity is increasingly being defined. For Meghan, the situation reflects a different kind of transformation. From actor and public figure to duchess to independent entrepreneur and media producer, her trajectory represents a broader shift in how public figures engage with institutions like the monarchy. Her focus on branding, independent global presence on the other, and the estate narrative, whether symbolic or structural, sits between those two worlds. Inside the royal household, however, the priority remains stability. The monarchy does not move quickly. It absorbs change slowly, often quietly, and rarely publicly acknowledges internal adjustments until long after they have already taken effect. This is why moments like this become so powerful in public discourse, because they reveal what is normally hidden: the tension between continuity and evolution, the struggle to maintain clarity in a system built on centuries of layered tradition, and the challenge of redefining roles in a family that is also an institution. As the story continues to circulate, one truth becomes increasingly clear. This is not just about one estate. It is about what the estate represents: authority, memory, belonging, and the question of who gets to carry those things forward into the next generation. And perhaps the most important shift of all is not the transfer of property itself, but the conversation it forces about the meaning of royal legacy in the modern world. Because legacy is no longer just inherited. It is interpreted, reframed, and sometimes redefined by those who stand both inside and outside the institution at the same time. In that sense, Harry and Meghan's connection to the Queen's estate, however it is understood, becomes part of a much larger evolution. A monarchy no longer defined solely by distance from the throne, but by the increasingly complex ways its story is shared, shaped, and understood across generations. And as that evolution continues, one final truth remains: the crown does not only live in palaces or titles, it lives in narrative. And right now, that narrative is still being written, between history and modernity, between duty and independence, and between the past that built it and the future that is still taking shape. And as the narrative